a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, crusaders, advocates, defenders, and word warriors. I'm Brooke Warner, excited to welcome you to an exciting episode of Memoir Nation, and I am here with Grant Faulkner. Grant, I want to pull back the curtain a bit on the guest procurement process with today's episode because we have Roxane Gay on the show, kind of a big deal. And she's not just a big deal, actually. She's a big get. And I think this is my third time asking her to come on. And maybe you've also asked her. And while perseverance and not taking no as a forever no are not themes of today's show, I wanted everyone to know that I am doing a little celebration dance over here.
We need to pause and celebrate you, Brooke. And I'm going to start with the forever no phrase. I haven't heard that before, and I love that. But I'm definitely celebrating with you. I remember giving a big wow when you told me she was going to come on. And that was a wow of excitement, but also a wow of I can't believe she's coming on our little podcast, because like you say, to get a guest like her is, I think of it like submitting a book to publishers. You're just going to get more rejections than acceptances. So thank you for not listening or not viewing it as a forever no, and for persevering and finding the path to success, because she is a great guest.
Yes, I totally. And, the real theme of today's show is actually this idea of memoir as manifesto, because that's a bit of a signature style of Roxane's, to do stuff that is manifesto-y in nature. She says in her interview that Bad Feminist definitely qualifies as a manifesto. Hunger is more of a straightforward memoir, but there are moments in Hunger that felt to me like manifesto. And what I mean by that when I think of memoirs as manifestos is that they have a bit of an agenda. They're making arguments. They're making points. Maybe they're offering up cultural criticism. Certainly the point is to make your readers think. And it's kind of funny, Grant, because you and I were guests at a literary salon recently at the home of our friend Connie Hale, who we had on the show not too long ago to talk about retreats. And there was someone in the audience who said that he was writing a memoir manifesto. And I instantly knew what he meant by that. I was kind of excited, frankly, because I like them a lot, because it's not exactly a genre of memoir, but memoirs can be vehicles for manifestos. Like I said, I've always personally loved it. And I think in part it's because we used to do quite a lot of them at Seal Press.
Yeah, that's interesting, Brooke, because I haven't put those two words together necessarily before this. And I think the word manifesto, it's kind of loaded with meanings for me. So I'm curious if you can say what qualifies a memoir as a manifesto also.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's a very famous book called Manifesta, which is like a feminist manifesto that I think maybe for people of my generation, our generation who are feminists, was maybe one of those early feminist manifestos. When I think of a manifesto, I think of the author's personal story being framed as a cultural or political statement. I read somewhere that a manifesto is when lived experience becomes argument, but argument to me is certainly not in a bad way. Like argument more like debating, or argument more like, I have something that I feel really passionate about. Like I think I'm an argumentative writer, when I write on Substack sometimes, because I have a point, and a point of view. Roxane decidedly does have a point and a point of view, and she argues her cases, whether it's about feminism or whether it's about bodies. In Hunger, big bodies, our cultural obsession with thinness. And I realize, Grant, as I'm talking that, we're kind of making an assumption that everybody knows who Roxane Gay is, and maybe they do and maybe they don't. She's a huge deal in our world, but maybe what we could both do is share a bit about who she is in the culture and who she is to us. Grant, maybe you could go first.
Yeah, I do have a story, and my story is actually, it's about her warmth and generosity. And way back in 2010, when I was just beginning to explore the idea of starting my little lit journal, 100-word story, and this was kind of, I guess I'll say it's my second or third chapter of my writing career, and I discovered Pank magazine, and I loved it as this online place to submit my stories. I felt my stories really fit in well. But I also just loved its look, its aesthetic and its font. I might have already been following Roxane on Twitter, where she was just starting to get a following. And then she got a huge following. But she was a very regular small press writer at this point. And Pank was only 4 years old and not a big journal by any means. And so I emailed her just out of the blue to find out more about Pank's design. And Roxane and I exchanged several emails. And then I later published a story in Pank. And then several years later, after Roxane became Roxane Gay, as I put it, because she did just kind of overnight become very famous, a very big presence in the literary community. And I was so touched to see her promoting Pank at the AWP conference every year. And she was just sitting behind a rickety table, handing out stickers, talking to people about the magazine. And I was just so touched by that, because she easily could have viewed herself as too big, too famous for such small time work. But I think it showed her dedication to small presses and her dedication to being a good literary citizen. And that might be the reason that she said yes to joining us on the podcast today. Roxane's commitment to small or underground presses has continued because she and her partner, the famous designer Debbie Millman, also a famous podcaster, who I'd also love to have on the podcast, but they bought the Rumpus last year, and the Rumpus has been so important to indie authors and small press authors. Now I want to hear your story, Brooke.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does go back a little bit too. I mean, just in terms of like my awareness of her was similarly quite early. I was at Seal for 9 years, and that was when Roxane first came on my radar. And I think it was from reading Jezebel. I was trying to remember. She was a regular contributor to Jezebel back then. I looked it up and found that she had several of the essays that were in Bad Feminist on Jezebel, and I was reading that pretty religiously back then. Roxane was a celebrated figure, just for being so honest and for writing about feminism in a relatable way. And there were also a handful of bloggers back then who were writing about the experience of being fat, like putting it out there in a way that was like, this is what it is. Stop tiptoeing around it. And she does this in Hunger as well. And during my time at Seal, I was very aware of this, sort of the body positivity movement, lots of other things happening. And it was like adjacent to feminist movements and other things. Virgie Tovar was one of the authors that we published at the time. She did an anthology called Hot and Heavy with us. She's on Substack as Virgie Tovar and is awesome. I highly recommend reading her stuff. Her tagline is, "Hi, I'm Virgie, and my entire life is about ending weight-based discrimination and anti-fat bias and helping to create a world where body diversity is celebrated, not feared." And so she was one of the people kind of alongside Roxane that I got an early education about, just all of this stuff about fat bodies, anti-fat bias, body positivity, like I said. And Roxane later contributed to Sari Botton's Goodbye to All That. We recently had Sari on the show. That anthology was one of Seal Press's better-selling anthologies about loving and leaving New York City. And so Roxane's a presence. I mean, she is prolific. She is unapologetic. She runs in our literary circles. But she also does have a reputation, I do want to say, for being a little bit standoffish sometimes. And I think that, people can be intimidated by her. And I confess that I have felt that way for sure. And then I got to meet her at the Bay Area Book Festival uniquely because I was behind stage and I was, introducing her event. And she wasn't standoffish at all. She was totally lovely. And so I think people, they get certain reputations and you have to be a little bit mindful of, how you're interacting with someone, and giving them, the benefit of the doubt to just be who they are. But I think she comes by honestly because she can be cutting, right, about things actually that maybe need to be cutting, like reality TV or trad wives or whatever other cultural phenomenon you're sitting there being like, what the hell is going on? So I do want to make a plug for Roxane's newsletter, The Audacity, because, you get her hot takes on stuff and she's certainly worth reading always.
Definitely. And I take comfort in somebody who you're getting their honest opinion. She's definitely never going to give you anything less than her 100% truth. And she's also a unique figure, I think, because she's very unabashed about her love of all things pop culture. So you have this deeply intellectual person who also revels in things that some intellectuals might just not take seriously. She was one of the first Black women to write for Marvel Comics, co-authoring World of Wakanda, a Black Panther spinoff, and she's also a serious and competitive cook, and she's joked about wanting to write a food memoir one day. So obviously we'll have to ask her about that in today's interview. But before we end, Brooke, going back to manifestos, since we often broaden out our topics, and you said you love them, and I'm not sure how many of these I've read. So what are a few examples?
Yeah, well, notably what came to mind was Fast Food Nation, which is certainly more than a memoir by Eric Schlosser. It's about fast food and its detrimental effects on our health. But Eric himself is the subject, and that's an old book, but I think completely still worth reading. It was probably one of the first real manifestos I read. Before Roxane Gay was on my radar, other feminists were writing manifestos, notably Elizabeth Wurtzel. You know, she's known for Prozac Nation, but she wrote this book called Bitch in Praise of Difficult Women, 1998, which is this fiery work of cultural criticism, but also a memoir. It's about how society treats women who don't conform to social expectations. I obviously loved that book when I read it. Later, I worked on a few books with Jessica Valenti, who we had on the show very early on. I think the most manifesto-y of her books was The Purity Myth, How America's Obsession with Virginity is Hurting Young Women. That was from 2009. And that was a feminist critique of how our culture equates a woman's worth with her sexual behavior. So there are obviously a lot of manifestos that are very feminist based. And I obviously would say that's the reason I've read a lot of them because of my history at SEAL. But I'd also say, Grant, that Miriam Gerba's work is very manifesto-y. You know, we just had her on the show a few weeks ago. Her book, Mean, in particular, has that going on for it for sure. And so if you read a memoir and you think to yourself, you know, this memoir, this memoirist really has a point to make and they're going at it with cultural criticism, it might be or probably is a manifesto.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been thinking I really associate the word manifesto with a kind of fiery outsider passion. And while I've always associated it with the Communist Manifesto, which of course isn't a memoir, I love the idea of tying the two together in memoir as manifesto or vice versa. And I'm now thinking of memoir manifestos that I've read without that label, like the autobiography of Malcolm X and Nickel and Dimed by Barbara Ehrenreich, Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and even Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. So I can't wait to talk to Roxane and learn more about what she is writing now. Well, Brooke, I'm always so pleased when we have a sponsor whose products and services I've actually used and enjoyed independently, and that's the case with Gotham Writers Workshop. I took my first class with them nearly 20 years ago, and it was an online class, my first online class ever. And I had my MFA at the time, and I have to say that my Gotham class was as good as any of my MFA classes. And in fact, the great writer Manuel Gonzalez taught it. But it wasn't just about Manuel. You know, all of the students in the course were super smart and really good writers. And amazingly enough, I'm still in touch with some of them. So I wholeheartedly recommend taking any of Gotham's courses.
I love that so much. And Gotham definitely has a high pedigree and it's been around for a long time. They offer creative writing classes in New York City, but also over Zoom and also asynchronous classes that you can take online. And so you can be anywhere in the world. And they have an amazing breadth of offerings, Grant. They offer memoir classes, woohoo, but also other nonfiction as well as fiction, poetry, songwriting, and many others. And with super qualified instructors and for an affordable price.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, they are very much about community, so you can stay involved with Gotham in a number of ways, and they even put on conferences. And writers often ask me how to find a writing group or beta reader, and I think taking a class is a great way to find good writing partner matches. So develop your craft and join a vibrant community of writers at Gotham Writers Workshop.
Yes, you can find them at gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting. Use our code, please, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply there, but definitely go check it out. And so endorse them, Grant.
Yeah. So one more time, visit gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting soon and use the code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir and Nation with no space between them, at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them that Grant sent you and Brooke too.
Welcome back, everyone. Well, lucky us, we have Roxane Gay with us today. Roxane Gay's writing appears in Best American Mystery Stories 2014, Best American Short Stories 2012, Best Sex Writing 2012, A Public Space, McSweeney's, and so many other places. She is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and the author of the books Haiti, An Untamed State, the New York Times best-selling Bad Feminist, the nationally best-selling Difficult Women, and the New York Times bestselling Hunger. She is also the author of World of Wakanda for Marvel, and she has several books forthcoming and is also at work on television and film projects. Please don't miss her Substack newsletter, The Audacity. Go check it out right now, and welcome, Roxane.
Thank you so much, Brooke.
Super thrilled to have you, and I want to get right into the first writing question I have that I've been wanting to ask you about. In Hunger, you write, I am using my voice not just for myself, but for people whose lives demand being seen and heard. And I think this is such a really powerful and important sentiment because, writers who have clarity, that what they're doing is a service, or an agenda or a mission are really particular kind of writers. And I wanted to ask you how you think about this or how your ideas about, writing as service or, for others who can't use their own voice maybe has morphed over the years.
One of the main ways in which my thinking around writing and voice has evolved is certainly that I do write for all kinds of people. I write first and foremost for myself, but I also write for, the people who don't get to be heard. But one of the many things I've learned over the course of my career is that no one's voiceless. They may not have opportunities to use their voices, but they have a voice. And so I try to be mindful of that in all of my work.
Well, Roxane, you share so many deeply personal things, and you wrote that Hunger was the hardest book to write. I'm not sure if that remains the case, and I'll let you say more on that. But my question is about how much memoirists share or should share. And I'm probing this personally in my own memoir, my first memoir. I think about it every time I write it. And I was wondering if you think readers expect more from memoirists now, that we mind the depths of our lived experience and that nothing should be off limits or very little should be off limits?
I think readers are greedy and they want everything. And it is our job as memoirists to resist and to only disclose what we can tolerate disclosing, it's not necessarily what feels safe, but what we can handle the world knowing about us. Vulnerability is incredibly important, and some would say it's a hallmark of my memoir nonfiction writing. And it's difficult to be vulnerable on the page, but the reason I'm able to do it is because I do have firm boundaries over what I'm willing to say and what I'm willing to share publicly. And it's just incredibly important that everyone have firm boundaries. And a lot of times, I think boundaries are the thing that most people struggle the most with, but we have to work on, at least on the page, being able to maintain those boundaries. Because once you put work out into the world, you have no control over what people are going to do with it, how they're going to judge the decisions that you've made and the way that you've lived your life. And so prepare yourself and protect yourself. And I also believe that we've seen, especially in recent years, what happens when people disclose too much. Several months ago, I read a memoir that's recently out that I think exemplifies what happens when you over-disclose, and radical oversharing kind of loses the plot. And so there are times when people over-disclose. And the reality is it's not the end of the world. It isn't. And some people love that. Some people love all the gory details. And good for them, but gory details do not necessarily translate into good writing. And so I always encourage memoirists to remember that you should only disclose what's going to enhance the story that you're trying to tell.
Really good advice. And, here we are, Roxane. I mean, I know that you follow a lot of pop culture and what's going on in the culture in general. And I imagine you've seen a little bit of the blowout from the Liz Gilbert memoir in the past week. And I'm really curious about your take on fallout in general. Not necessarily that you have to give us all the Liz Gilbert takes, but more just about the fact that this seems to me to be particularly gendered, that when a woman writes a memoir, and I'm interested too what you said about oversharing, because perhaps she did. But I wondered, because you came to mind as a person, who probably suffered from some fallout in the aftermath of your own memoirs. And, just if you might say more about that.
Well, that is the memoir I was referring to in the previous question. The book is not good. And I say that while respecting Gilbert's talent. She's an amazing writer, and anyone who says otherwise is lying. Or, well, I mean, it's all subjective, but much of her body of work is genuinely excellent. She knows how to craft a beautiful sentence. That craft is not readily apparent in the new book. I'm not sure what happened there. There are, of course, some characteristically nice sentences, but they're surrounded by a lot of over-disclosure, just unrepentant navel-gazing, and the poetry is ill-advised. The drawings are ill-advised. But I suspect she made the book she wanted, because she's certainly at a point in her career where she can. And she is a nice person. I don't know her personally, but I have collaborated with her professionally, and she's very generous. And so any critique I offer is genuinely just of the book. And I find the fallout to be a little unhinged. I think that people wait until they see vulnerability in popular writers, and then they all jump on, because they didn't have the courage to do it when they really first felt those thoughts, if they felt them. And so I'm interested in that. I'm actually writing about it in my review of the book, because I have seen people diagnosed with a range of mental illnesses, and I really don't care for when people armchair diagnose people simply because they don't like them, or they don't like their work, they don't like how they live their lives. That's not inherently mental illness. And when you sort of armchair diagnose, that's you telling the world that you can't find your words. You don't have the adequate language skills to express what you really want to say. So you want to put this person in a mental illness container. It's not great. I don't think we should do it. And we've all done it from time to time, but the older I get, the more mindful I am of recognizing that I don't know. You don't know. Maybe she's got some stuff going on, but it's not the point. And like, either you're talking about the book or you're talking about her as a person. And unfortunately, more people are talking about the writer than they are about the book. And frankly, most of the people talking about the book haven't read it.
Right. Because it just came out the week that everybody is talking about it. And I had to laugh, though, with the New York Times, because I had just read your book, Hunger, and then I read the Times piece that dinged Liz for not citing Grey's Anatomy for using my person. And of course, you use my person a lot, and you say you love Grey's Anatomy, but you don't cite Grey's Anatomy. And it just seemed like one of those insane asides.
And it was meant to be funny. I thought it was very good in that it was fair, it was honest, it was accurate. The Times review, clearly the author read the book. The Grey's Anatomy aside, I took as a joke, because like, why at this point, person as romantic partner has been in the vernacular for so long that everyone knows it's from Grey's Anatomy, and you no longer need to like cite that as a source because it's common wisdom.
Fair enough. That's a good reframe.
Roxane, Brooke and I were talking about your work and the style of work that you do. And because of Brooke's history at Seal Press, the idea of memoir as manifesto came up. And I was curious what your thoughts are if someone calls your work a manifesto or a polemic or any other of these other terms that suggest you are making an argument or taking a position on something. And actually Googled memoir manifestos, and Bad Feminist was one of the top results. So I'm curious if you like that, or do you think otherwise, or of what you're working to achieve?
It depends on which book you're talking about. Like, I don't consider Bad Feminist a memoir at all. I think of it as an essay collection of cultural criticism. And I certainly draw from the personal in some of the essays, but that is definitely, if not a manifesto, it is an argument. I think memoir can be a manifesto. Arundhati Roy, I think, gets into that territory. I don't think you could look at any writer and say all of their work is memoir manifesto, because generally we tend to have different projects from one book to the next in terms of what we want to achieve with the book, what we want the reader to receive from the book.
Yeah, it's helpful. What about Hunger? Just out of curiosity, more traditional memoir?
That's definitely a memoir. I can see why people would read it as manifesto, because I was certainly arguing in the book for more cultural nuance when it comes to understanding the experience of living in a fat body and looking at all of the cultural ideas we have around fatness that are incredibly toxic.
Right. So there are arguments in there, and they're great ones, of course. It's a good segue to my next question, which is about shame. You probably won't be surprised to hear that shame comes up a lot as a topic on this show. Memoirists, it seems, don't really get to do what they do without dipping themselves in shame baths. And you write pretty eloquently and honestly about shame and hunger. And I was a little honestly surprised at the depth of it, since your public persona is so, badass, for lack of a better, more creative word. And I was curious if you could share the impact of sharing your shame and whether it released some of it for you or made it better in any way or not.
I think it's difficult to write about shame. That requires the vulnerability we were talking about earlier. And so I can't say that it necessarily released any, but there is some relief in admitting I'm carrying this shame. I'm very fortunate in that while I certainly harbor shame about some things, I don't live my life drowning in it. But so many people experience shame and carry it in silence, and they feel like it's a solitary experience. And if I can let one person know through Hunger, for example, that you are not alone in having shame, and that the real shame is not you, but anyone who has harmed you. Like, that's where the shame lies. And if I can help people even temporarily redirect shame, then I feel like I've done some reasonably good work.
Roxane, our final question for you is, it's interesting because I actually started following you on Twitter. I want to say it was 2008 or 2009. I know it was before you were famous. And in reading Hunger, you share about how you got into the online world at a fairly early point in the internet, and that the internet for you gave you anonymity. And then later you said about writing that one of the things you love about it is that anyone can write. Your looks don't matter. And again, you mentioned the anonymity. But of course, now you're the opposite of anonymous. You're, very public, and I assume you get recognized everywhere you go. And I was curious when I was reading about some of the invisibility you felt before you got famous. And I was curious about the contrast of being invisible and then so visible and anonymous and so well known. In what ways does your visibility impact your writing, and whether that's your actual writing or your writing habits?
I don't think of myself as visible, but I certainly do recognize that I am at a stage of my career where more people know me than the average writer, because, for most of us, when we write, we toil in relative obscurity, and that's okay because, you love the writing. So the fact that I can get recognized is alarming in many ways, because I'm a writer. I never intended to be in front of like the proverbial camera. And so while it hasn't necessarily affected my writing, it has made me a little more cautious, which I don't like. And it's made me cautious for a few reasons. One, people offer very little margin for error. Liz Gilbert's current situation reflects that. And I write about this in Bad Feminist, like, don't put me on a pedestal. But oftentimes people love to put public figures, and I don't include myself in that public figure part, but people love to put public figures on pedestals and wait for them to do something disappointing and then tear them down. And I'm not sure what it is in human nature that encourages us to do that, but we do it. And so I feel a lot of pressure to have every opinion and every argument that I make be perfect, when perfect is not the goal, and perfect is actually a very problematic idea anyway. So it's challenging, and I have to get out of my own way these days. And that's frustrating because it hampers the writing.
Well, thanks for all of that, Roxane. It's super insightful and great to have you on with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Roxane, thank you so much. I think you are a public figure. When I saw you at AWP behind the pank table after you'd really taken off, I was like, wow, Roxane Gay is still doing the pank table.
Oh, forever. Now I'm going to be doing the rumpus table. I can't wait.
Yeah. Thank you for buying the rumpus.
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you for that.
We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Well, Grant, today's book trend is one I've been watching with a bit of shock and awe as it unfolds in real time on our social media feeds. And that is something that we actually did get to talk to Roxane about. I wasn't sure if it was going to come up in the interview in the way that it did. I mean, we asked her about the book, but I wasn't sure she was going to say much about it, and she did. So you have a little bit of context as we, wind down the interview or show here today. But that is the vitriol and disdain that is landing on Liz Gilbert's lap right now, coming on the heels of her new memoir, which is called All the Way to the River. I wanted this to be the book trend. I just wanted to turn it over a bit, and see if we can parse out all the many reasons that she is getting so much blowback for this book. So where to even start? Yeah,
I think we start when I got a text at nearly midnight one night, and a friend of mine was like, oh my gosh, have you read this? It was like so urgent. And I think we can certainly pinpoint the beginning of it to the excerpt that ran in The Guardian. That was the link she actually sent me, where Liz Gilbert confesses to having basically a murderous fantasy of killing her late partner, Rhea. And Rhea was super drugged out because she had a diagnosis of terminal cancer and had basically decided to party her way to the grave. But that was making Liz's life miserable, and Liz was herself not in the best place. And you could call this a rock bottom moment, probably, and there was a lot of drugs involved that was impacting both of them and both of their mindsets. But people read that and have latched onto it in a major way. It seems to be one of the big reasons people are losing it over this memoir anyway. And yeah, talking about thinking about murdering someone is a pretty intense thing. I do agree with that. And also, I think she was being honest about her state of mind, and I don't believe she was even remotely close to executing her plan. So I want to say that her honesty and her revelation should be seen, for me, as brave, and as maybe even a common challenge that people who are in such a demanding caretaking role might share. Maybe they've had that thought as well. Brooke, do you want to name some other reasons people seem to be so upset?
Yeah, the other big one that comes to mind has to do with how she talks about addiction. She makes some pretty sweeping assertions that we are all addicts. I have to say that I read what she wrote, and she actually says that the most exaggerated version of us is an addict. But people are mad that she, maybe in some places seems to be glamorizing addiction. Though I will say that now that I've read the book, I don't really think she's doing that. I also think that people are mad that Liz Gilbert has thoughts on all of this stuff, honestly. I mean, that's my take on it. Like, most of the people who are upset in this are like, I am an addict and I, have a mentally ill friend or brother, or I was suicidal. And then they go on to say how completely shitty Liz Gilbert is for writing this book, and the implication to me is that she shouldn't have thoughts on things that they have a corner on. And Grant, I kind of feel like if you have these thoughts and feelings about it, write your own stuff and share your journey. And you let Liz's take on what happened between her and Rhea and what happened to Liz herself, which is partly also about coming to terms with being a sex and love addict. Let her have her thing, right? But I think Roxane sort of spoke to it perfectly, which is like people are really attacking Liz and not the book. And so in my experience of Liz Gilbert, like she's really always been pretty honest about being a mess. And so I don't think that this book is, like at all out of character or inauthentic.
Yeah. And so it's just so interesting to me how much people seem to just get off on hating her, actually. And I mean, obviously she has a massive following and fans and as many people who love her, but the hate crowd is very strong. And she's gotten tons of hate following every memoir she's written, tons of hate for leaving her Brazilian husband for Rhea. And it reminds me a little bit of Taylor Swift, actually, how much people love her and hate her. And that seems to be reserved for a particular kind of person. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I agree. I'm actually going to get into the fray this weekend on my Substack about this. So I'm writing it now. By the time this episode comes out, that Substack will be out. But I was thinking about opening along the lines of Liz Gilbert pisses white women off so much because we see ourselves in her.
Right.
That's my take. What I'm really gleaning the more I listen is that there's just a lot of projection going on, a whole lot of resentment of Liz for writing about her truth. And what is that about? Like these women who are pissed, from what I see, like a lot of times they're other writers. There are certainly people who would definitely write a memoir if they could. So I thought that was kind of interesting about what Roxane said, like sort of then do it, right? Like stop talking about your own thing. Just go ahead and put it out there. And these women who are so pissed off, from what I see in my feed, a lot of times they're other writers, so it really does beg the question of what their anger is about. And I am just going to kind of go back to projection. And, someone in one of my feeds suggested jealousy. I don't put that past people at all. I mean, I think that we see her success and her money and all of this stuff. And then her messiness is kind of infuriating to people because she's also at the same time professing to be on a spiritual journey or finding herself. But to me, it's sort of the quintessential white American woman. Like, I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. It's like, I just feel that way when I look at her. And then people are lashing out and, being all mad with her for all kinds of different things. And it's just kind of crazy to watch. But I come from a place, Grant, of having always liked Liz as a person. I've actually met her several times. I think she's very genuine. She's generous to a fault. She writes about, like, actually it's nearly problematically generous. She writes about it in her book. And I just don't think she deserves what's been coming her way. And I've felt kind of bummed to watch it unfold.
Yeah, if anything, it's like an interesting kind of like loop back or commentary on her previous books, that the life is messy and hard, and I think that this is also, as you say, very gendered. And I wondered about that. And I've seen a couple posts by people who said that this has nothing to do with gender, but it's hard to imagine a comparable backlash to a male writer. I can even barely think of one. Maybe the only comparable fallout would be to James Fry, but he lied about a lot of things, and so people aren't mad for the same reasons. So it seems to me that people are mad at Liz's hubris, I guess, that she dares to be an authoritative voice on things, and because of that confidence of her voice, and because she sells so many books and she's so famous, people just want to knock her off that pedestal.
Yeah, that's, and Roxane was saying that too. That pedestal thing is pretty dangerous. And if you get too high on it, you are going to get knocked off. And I think that the commentary on social media has reached a fever pitch, and it's also because it started before the book even came out. And then all kinds of people were like, I'm not even going to read it, and it's just like wild to me because I'm sitting here just thinking like, this is a mob fest. And I really can't imagine what it's like for Liz, although, at least it's not her first rodeo. And so maybe she's handling it better for that alone. Yeah,
for sure. And she'll weather it and she'll sell a lot of books. So maybe that takes the edge off a little as well. But it's never fun to watch people turn on someone like this. And I think you posed a good question to people on your Facebook feed, Brooke, which is that if you're having such a strong reaction to Liz's book, then why? That's all, an open-ended question. And what does that say about you?
Right, exactly. It's a powerful inquiry, and it goes back to projection being, for me, kind of the primary lens that I want to look at this through, because I'll just share a closing anecdote, which is that when I first read Eat, Pray, Love, I didn't like it. I was going through my own divorce at the time, and I found her very annoying. I just was like, oh my gosh, she's so perfect and blah, blah, blah. All the things that people don't like Liz for, like she's too good, basically. Then, fast forward, I read it years later and I loved it. And I realized it was not that Eat, Pray, Love was not a good book. It's that it struck a chord with me at the time. It was too close to home. I didn't like Liz at that time, for being a version of a woman that I couldn't be in that same circumstance. And that is projection, so I do know what it is. I think I've grown a lot since that time, because I was like 28 years old when I read the book, and I have a lot more self-awareness. But I've also watched all of these kinds of things unfold over the years, right? Like the pylons that are reserved for memoirists, often female. And so there's just a lot to unpack here, I think, for us, for our listeners, about blowback, fallout, and the underbelly of exposure. So, Grant, we do have to make more time for that kind of conversation this season, and we will. We promise. And so to all of our listeners out there, thank you. We wish you luck on this sometimes fraught journey of memoir writing. Just being a memoirist and thinking about memoir and all this stuff, when you see this fallout, it can be kind of scary sometimes. So take heart, because it's a consideration, but it shouldn't stop you. And that's the main message that I want to convey. And until next time, we'll see you next week.